I'm John Horn at KPCC. Thank you for joining us for this conversation about the making of Mank. We are joined by cinematographer Erik Messerschmidt, production designer Donald Graham Burt, and sound designer Klyce. Welcome, everybody.
Thank you
for having us.
Thank you.
So I think it's fair to say that any good director is exacting in his or her attention to detail, very specific. And let's just say that David Fincher is especially specific. And I'm wondering how that plays out on a project. What are the benefits when a director knows exactly what he wants, and maybe some of the risks that you have in collaborating with him creatively?
The best analogy I've come up with is that, you know, anyone can stand up in front of the LA Philharmonic and they can wave the baton and the orchestra will play. That doesn't make that person a conductor. David understands all of the instruments that we're playing. And he understands how to adjust the tempo. He understands how to accent certain phrases of the orchestration. So as you know, in the analogy, if we were to carry that forward, like I think as orchestral musicians, he gives us the opportunity to do our best work. And for me, that's the most special part about working for someone like that, he really understands what it is we are all doing and gives us the best opportunity to support each other and support the project. And it's a very special thing.
Yeah, and to add on to your analogy, Erik, I think also he knows that piece of music very well before he even goes up and picks up the baton. Yeah. And more than anybody I've worked with. And you can be sure that, you know, any project he's thought through and it's complete in his mind. And he not only allows us to play our instruments, he knows the pitfalls that we face. He understands when, you know, for instance, when the art department comes up against obstacles, he understands, you know, and he listens to it and he wants to hear it and he wants to be part of the decision making. So if I could add to your whole orchestra analogy there.
I love that. Ren, you want to jump on the symphony bandwagon?
Sure. Yeah, I love the analogy. I would say what's great about David is that in his directing, he knows what he wants. And oftentimes I know that both Erik and Don have had this experience where you're working with someone, let's say in advertising, and they don't know what they want. And what they want instead is but they know what they don't want. You know what I mean? And I think that can be really hard for people like Erik or Don or even myself, because without being directed and having a sense of where we're headed, you would be left with come up with an idea and how's this on for how's this hat, you know, I don't like it. Show me another one, but this time show me a shoe. It's like, well, okay. So David's very good in that he already has an idea of what he wants, and he gets you as close to as possible to the concept, and then he lets you free to then explore what you think is what it is that would make it work for him.
It's sort of like, I mean, if we really want to take it one step further, it's like when it's the soloist's opportunity, he makes sure that you have the opportunity to do that work while the rest of the orchestra supports you, you know, so that it all is cohesive and holistic, you know. That's otherwise, you know, when you don't have someone like that, when you don't have a maestro at work making sure it can be very disjointed and it gets dysfunctional, and that's to Ren's point, I think is very much it's the magic of it for us.
I think sometimes, you know, again, speaking to Ren's point, you get on projects and it's a different process, and different directors have different ways of working. And sometimes you get with directors that it's part of their method to sort of search for what the movie is while they're kind of doing it. I don't know if you guys have experienced that or not, but, you know, it's a whole different way of working. But you know, sometimes it's hard to grasp onto certain things in that process as people that are trying to support the vision. And with David, David comes in very efficient, and he comes in knowing, as Ren says, knowing exactly what he wants. And then after he lays out that template, as I have said with my work with him on Mank, we spent time together early on, and he formulated this framework. And then within that framework, there's a lot of room for creative expansion. And, that's the great thing about working with him. You know what you're working on.
I'm going to go back to all of your initial conversations with David about this project, and it obviously will drive some of the creative choices you made. But the broader idea is the difference between homage and pastiche and parody, that you're referencing another film in its look, in its sound, in its design. But at a certain point, if you cross over that line, it doesn't work. So in your conversations, the earliest initial conversations with David, did you talk about that line, or is it something that you always understood about? There is reference. I mean, you can have a liquor bottle falling like a snow globe, but you don't want to go too far. And where did you decide that line was?
We were on another project and doing a feasibility study, and he brought this film up. And when that project postponed, he sent me the script, and then I was engaged in it. And I was meeting with him early on before any other crew people became engaged in it. And it was always presented to me as its own film. And to the extent where I remember one day in his office, and I know Ren and Erik have heard me say this before, but one day in his office, there was just a moment that resonated with me through the whole picture where he said to me, I want it to feel like you're in a film vault and you're going along and you're seeing the labels and the titles for all these different movies, and you come across Citizen Kane, and right next to it is there's this movie called Mank, and you pull it out and you go, oh, I haven't heard of this one. And then you watch it and you realize it was made at the very same time. And, there are some visual references to Citizen Kane in it. We did The Hallway of Mirrors, but we didn't make an attempt to accentuate it or to pronounce it. We just sort of said it's here. And if we capture it, if Erik captures it in his framing, that's fine. But if not, at least we know it's there, and it does something spiritually, I think, and Erik, correct me if I'm wrong on that. But.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, initially we talked about the things that we admired about Citizen Kane, and we admired about Toland's work in general, I think, and certainly other parts of Welles's work, and things that resonated with us. But we were making our own film, and we were primarily focused on the story that we had to tell, within the context of the time period and the style we wanted to tell it. But I think you make an excellent point. I mean, that was certainly my place of anxiety during the project, was making sure that we were honoring the story, and we were being as responsible and nuanced as we could without getting into. I mean, parody was my biggest fear. I mean, I think these sort of pastiche and homage is on one side of it, and as you start to approach parody is where it starts to get problematic. And I mean, Don and I had a number of conversations about that, about where the line was. And, there were moments in the production where I started to get insecure about it, and sort of was like, trying to figure out where that was. But yeah, I mean, that was a conversation. But I mean, I think in terms of the prep, and as we figured out what the film was going to be, we were really just focused on what we had to do. And there wasn't at least my conversations with David and Don and everyone else, it wasn't like, what will we not do? It was like, well, kind of what will we do, in a way.
Yeah.
I'm going to just add, Toland is Greg Toland, who shot Citizen Kane. And he also shot Grapes of Wrath, which also looks like an influence on this film. Ren, what about that idea of pastiche on the one side, parody on the other, that you're trying to create a sound that is lost to most people? And it might be unfamiliar, but it might trigger some memory of being in a movie theater when we were kids. So what was your approach to that part of the equation?
It was important to David to have this aesthetic that Don described. And I think we all had a very similar conversation with David about a film vault and finding a film, and it was Mank next to Citizen Kane. You dust it off and you watch it. But so we knew where we were going to go. But one of the words that David often uses as sort of as like the boundary is, I want to go towards something like this, but I never want to ape something. I don't want to copy something. And he'll use that in regards to sound and to music as well. With Trent and Atticus, he wouldn't say to them, I want this score to sound, like Citizen Kane. And, he would say, well, whatever, again, to the first conversation, whatever you think, I leave it in your hands, And so for us with the sound, it was the same, that we knew the direction that we had to go. And we knew that we had to make it crackly and monaural and fuzzy. And just as Erik had to make it black and white, and Don had to make it with these beautiful textures visually that had to be of a certain era, but there wasn't like some code like, well, no, we still are missing this from the other film. We certainly didn't have that. So, but not to say that we didn't study the other films, at least in our world, in the sound world, we did, and listening to Bernard Herrmann's music, and hearing the production of how those films were made sonically. There was definitely a signature to the technology and a constraint to the technology. And so we aspired to work within what it would be like if we had those tools. Right. And that was sort of our stepping point.
Well, I want to follow up on that, and I want to ask about your overall design, because we obviously live in an era of Dolby Atmos, multi-channel surround sound, and that might just be in some studio executive's home screening room. So how do you use all of the modern sound technology tools to make something sound monophonic? Take something digital and make it analog. And I guess that means that at certain points, words that David Fincher rarely speaks, he would say, that's too good, it has to be worse.
When we started, one of the first things we tried to do is take the recordings that Drew had made in the production sound, which was largely dialogue. And then we would take the assembly edit that Kirk was cutting and get a rough track, and then we would lay it off, or we would lay it off to analog tape, thinking, oh, let's print it to analog and then come back, and then that's going to have all the magic sauce on it. And what we learned was that it sounded fantastic. So we thought, let's go down a generation. Then we came back, it still sounded fantastic. Let's go down to third generation. That still sounded fantastic. Let's turn off the noise reduction. Like, no matter what we did, the technology was still too good, if you know what I mean. So it was definitely a process of finding what we called the sound, and we named it the patina. And David called it the patina, both for the sound and for the visuals. And so it was a process of finding that, and in the end, really using noise. Really, we had to add actual distortion. We added distortion to the sound effects, to the dialogue, to the music in different proportions. We added noise and the sound of an optical film without anybody talking, and then we stole little bits and pieces, and then made loops of that, and then played those sounds underneath the mix.
And even though you have tools that can add reverb or echo, you actually played the film back in a theater and then recorded that audio as it's echoing off the theater walls to get the final mix?
Yes, that was the last step. And he was very much wanting to have an emotional response, not just from the old-fashioned sound of the film, but in addition to that, an experience of hearing that old-fashioned sound in a large, echoey theater. And he has a very strong memory of walking into a particular theater and opening the door, and the echo of the door made a sound which startled him. And the realization that the acoustics of the theaters that they used to screen these films were largely held over from a different era, unlike, very different from what we have now in modern theaters. And so, yes, he said, can we possibly play this entire mix when we're done in a movie theater and re-record the echo back? And so that's what we did. It wasn't in a movie theater, but it was something similar to a movie theater. And we recorded the sound of the room and then added the sound of the room back into the surrounds of the mix. And that's what you hear.
Don, as far as I know, the last movie to shoot at Hearst Castle was Spartacus. And the last shoot at the castle was a Lady Gaga video for her song GUI.
You're right.
I've done my homework.
Yeah.
And I suspect it's not even a conversation that's worth having because there's so much reference. But given all the reference that you have from Hearst Castle, how do you go about recreating interiors? And because Hearst himself was a very, he's a prolific collector, but he took a little bit of everything when he went to Europe. So there's not really a common theme.
No, there isn't. There's a real mix of styles, both architectural and in the antiquities that he collected. And, you know, it began by just, of course, looking at reference material. And we looked at reference material, or I did in the very beginning before anybody started. I looked at reference material that was current day of what we now call Hearst Castle. And I looked at period reference material for San Simeon. And I was so attracted to the period reference material because it was all in black and white, and that was the world that we were going to enter. And it sort of muted some of the details that were so apparent in the current day reference material. So, you know, in looking at it, we had the obvious restraints or constraints of a film with budget and schedule and so forth. And, you know, I knew it just had to be simplified. So, you know, I just sat and I talked with my art director and set decorator, Jan Pascal, and we discussed sort of the predominant elements that we wanted to show to sort of emulate instead of replicate what San Simeon is. So it was more about that. I mean, in terms of laying out furniture, laying out the antiquities, you know, we wanted to use a little more purposefulness than what William Randolph Hearst used. He sort of just, in some places, just jammed things in a room, and that wasn't appropriate for what we were doing. And, you know, we had to serve our film, we had to serve our story. So it was more about, you know, putting together sets that felt like you were in a place, as opposed to saying you are exactly in this place. Because if I was trying to replicate it, I'd still be working on it right now. I think, you know, there's just no way. I didn't even go there. I've never been there. I didn't want to go there. When I saw the photos, actually, when I saw the videos of people lining up with their families to go there, I said, I'd rather go to Knott's Berry Farm. You know, it's like, I'll learn more from that.
Control the crowds too.
Yeah. So anyway, that was the approach to it. Restraint, you know, restraint.
In terms of practical locations, there's a quick shot of Bullock's Wilshire. It looks like Bullock's Wilshire, which is now, I think, the Southwestern Law School.
Correct.
But studio lots, you know, what you have to use, what you have to mask. Is the North Ferdy Ranch where Mankiewicz wrote still exist, or do you have to build that too?
Oh, no, that still existed. And that surprised me. When I first read the script, I was like, oh my goodness, where are we going to find this ranch and how are we going to make it work? And how much money do we have to build this? And, you know, then I did some online work and I realized that it's called the Kemper Campbell Ranch and it still exists. And it's, I mean, Eric, I don't know, it's fairly intact.
The photos of Mankiewicz writing the script out on the patio, it's the same patio. It's almost, I mean, it was extremely close. Amazing. Yeah.
Eric, I want to ask you about not so much the choice to shoot in black and white, but what that set in motion in terms of depth of field, in terms of practical light, in terms of lighting sets. What were the biggest challenges to work in black and white? And did you work in black and white or color and then degrade it to black and white? And trying to capture the same depth of field and some of the same camera angles that people know instinctively are from that era.
Well, you know, I think the contemporary film audience, and certainly, I mean, I'm guilty of it too. We associate black and white cinema with a very narrow spectrum of what black and white really is, and certainly what it represents within the broad spectrum of cinema history. And it wasn't until I dived deep into the research for this movie that I really fully understood the kind of, in terms of technique and application of technique, particularly with lighting, how broad it really is, and what our opportunities were to kind of pick and choose various techniques and aesthetics best support the movie, you know. There were certain elements of the period that we wanted to emulate. Certainly from Citizen Kane, we were interested in deep focus photography and working in deep focus, and it was something that both David and I responded to. And in actuality, probably it has more to do just with the fact that we thought it looked better in black and white than it necessarily has to do with the fact that there was something that Toland and Wells had done in Citizen Kane, even though they made it famous and it's something we remember from the film. But that was something we really wanted to do and we wanted to explore, and it took a little bit of testing and prep and etc. But yeah, there's a bit of a learning curve, you know, figuring out how we wanted to approach each particular location, how we wanted to approach each aesthetic, and how to make sure that each scene in context worked, you know, because it's really easy to be just extremely gestured and stylistic in black and white, and I was worried that if we went too far, then we would have to go that far in every scene, and then it wouldn't really work. And it was like, so you're kind of constantly trying to judge yourself, and I think it's a little bit more complex in black and white than it would be in color, because in color it's quite obvious. When you go really stylized in color, it's really obvious, and you know, in black and white it's a little trickier. So it took a little bit of time, and we did a lot of testing, which really helped. And you know, all the testing I did with Dawn and Tris Somerville and Jan and Gigi Williams, the makeup artist, and really figuring out what our tones were and what tones worked well in combination with each other. And you know, that was incredibly helpful for all of us, and certainly for me, in sort of devising our plan and our approach as we went into each location and set, you know.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to ask all three of you about two scenes. I'm going to start by asking Erik, I think, about the scene, and you can all chime in, where Mank and Marion are touring Hearst Castle. I guess if you shoot it at night and light it, it's going to look lit. And you probably wouldn't get the depth of field, the expanse of the estate. So I am assuming you shot day for night, but what does that mean in terms of the practicalities of lighting, what it means for the actors? How did you solve, if you make that choice, what did that set in motion that complicated other things?
You know, I had been doing, I was shooting a television show actually for Ridley Scott called Raised by Wolves, and we had done all of our night work as day for night. And I had been sending, it was the first time I had really done anything serious like that. I had sent David a bunch of stills, like frame grabs of what we were doing. And I was like, hey, check this out. This is kind of cool. And he liked it. He thought, oh, that's interesting. And then, but we were just sort of chatting off the cuff, you know, what it was I was doing. I was in Africa, you know, and I got back to the States and we started prepping the movie, and Dawn had found the locations to shoot the San Simeon sequence in, which was a combination of Huntington Gardens in Pasadena and some backyard of a mansion in San Marino, I think. And they were these kind of vast spaces, and we wanted the audience to appreciate the scope of the estate. And David said, well, let's do the day for night thing you did. Like, let's do that. Like, why don't we try to do that? And I thought it was a great idea. I mean, it's certainly something that they would have done then. And the practicalities of lighting that space, both in terms of what the limitations were, particularly at Huntington Gardens, in terms of logistically where we could put construction cranes and, you know, the resources it would have taken to really light that space, but also just in terms of what they would have done in 1938. You know, it most certainly probably would have been done day for night. So it seemed like a great idea. And so we did a bunch of testing, and Dawn built these beautiful street lights for us that we put big light bulbs in. And anyway, yeah, it was quite a bit of fun to figure out how to do it. But I'm really glad we did it that way. It was great.
Talked about interiors of the Hearst Castle, about that look of the exteriors when you're having to work on an outdoor set, a house in the Huntington Gardens. What are the challenges and what are the opportunities?
We just kept it simple. And, the whole sequence was about them walking and talking and kind of going by what Hearst had as a zoo. And if you saw the real zoo that he had on his grounds in the day, you'd be like, oh my goodness. So, we decided to bring some elegance to it, and we built some stone walls with some ironwork to them. And as Erik said, we had seen in the reference photos repeatedly on the grounds these sort of sculpted light posts that felt, I don't know what period they were from. I want to say Renaissance or something, but they looked very sort of Venetian that were brought in, and they had these large globes on them. And we made 20 or 30 of those, I think, and we brought those and we used them in each area that we filmed. Because we were spread out in like 3 or 4 different areas of Huntington Gardens, and Huntington Gardens, if you know, is quite a large estate, the grounds there. And the grip and electrical crew did a great job in handling that location. I must say that for the day for night. But for us in the art department, we really just wanted to keep it simple. We wanted to exemplify the elegance of the estate. So we made these stone walls. We did marble balustrades that we brought in. We did some statuary that was very much something Hearst was attuned to having on his property. And we just dressed all these different locations so that we could sort of hop from one to another. That sounds easier said like that than it was actually done, but that was sort of the approach to establishing what the exterior was.
And Ren, there's also a sonic volume to that scene. I mean, we hear the animals, but it also feels like they're on the top of this mountain, that there really is depth to what they are surrounded by. How did you go about creating that?
Yeah, that's a really fun sequence for all of us. And it's, I'm glad we're talking about it. A lot of things to say about what we built for that sonically. The first bit is that, by trying to contrast the sequence that we just came out of, which was the big dialogue sequence inside with Charlie Chaplin, and when Marion kind of makes the gaffe and has to go outside. And so David really wanted to have a big contrast from the sound of this harsh, echoey interior. And so when we land outside, we really wanted to have a contrast. And one of the things Dave and I were talking about in terms of textures was, the first thing was San Simeon. It's near the ocean. So, and I sort of thought, well, what if we had as the deep background, like ocean waves crashing on the beach? Like, it's so much the opposite of this loud party that now we're outside, we can even hear the distant waves crashing. And all the beautiful pieces that Don and his team had built, like the fountain, for example, that was very challenging for us because it was the most beautiful looking, and sorry, Don, terrible sounding fountain, at least in terms of how we could mix the sound and the dialogue. And we struggled with that sequence to the point where David, and there were other technical problems from the sound point. You mentioned, we had trucks backing up. We had all sorts of problems. So we realized, like, for example, the scene at the end when they're on the fountain, we had to re-record everything. And in fact, the entire sequence is all re-recorded, dialogue, sound effects, and everything. So we built a jewelry sound for Marion's jewelry, her cloth and her clothing. We had to figure out what were the best textures to add underneath the track. She's barefoot and she's traveling from different surfaces. So she's on grass, she's on crushed granite. Mank is, wearing hard leather shoes. So we had to get those textures right. And then, of course, all the scene cuts where we're outside and there's slaps on their voices coming off the various statuettes. And then when we cut to the inner areas where we're in foliage, we wanted to get a sense of birds and night activity from wildlife. The animals, of course, that they were all CG'd, that's all, nothing was really there. So those are fun. Giraffes don't make a sound. They weren't there. So coming up with those sounds were a lot of fun. But I think it was mostly for us, in terms of our build, the fountain. David is very obsessed with the feeling that fountain was feeling opulent as it looked. He wanted to feel expensive sonically and have the drops, but he wanted to hear every detail. He wanted to hear her jewelry. He wanted to hear her bare feet on the falling into Mank's arms, and their intimate dialogue. So that for us, it was a real fun sequence. And the birds that are CG'd flying in the background.
Here's my last question. It's about the last big scene with Mank, the speech, rant, whatever we want to call it, his long monologue. The question I want to ask each of you was, what was the biggest creative challenge in that scene, and how did you solve it?
My favorite thing on a daily basis of working with David is watching the rehearsal and those winks and nods between us as we're silently figuring out what the coverage for the scene is going to be. And we have these sort of hand gestures and from here, right? And then we'll get that piece. And then she turns, did you see her turn here? We should make sure we get that. And there's this kind of sign language process that he and I go through during the rehearsal of developing the coverage plan, particularly on a dialogue scene like that, that's quite complex, that has lots of bits to it. And I love that part of the process with David, is really sort of breaking down the scene and thinking about it editorially and sequentially and putting that together in my head in terms of how we're going to light it basically, and I put that all together, and we rehearsed it on a Saturday in advance with Arliss and Gary and Amanda and Charles, and sort of had a pretty good idea of what we were going to do, and we had a really good idea of how many pieces of coverage we needed to do, and then I felt super confident going into it, and we lit it, and it was also supposed to be this kind of cavern-like, castle, musty interior, top lit, very kind of dim and simple. And then Amanda walked out in this costume that Trish had put her in, and she's in this, incredible outfit. And it became incredibly obvious at that very moment that no, we had to deal with her in a very specific, special way that none of us, and myself included, had anticipated. And I had to, kind of quickly reorient, and we lit her in a very classic late 1930s way, but it was one of those things that just became blatantly obvious in the moment once she walked out in the costume, and it was like, okay, hold on a second, we just give me 10 minutes to deal with this, but it's not something that was particularly clear while the actors were rehearsing in sweatpants and baseball hats, so that, I don't know, I mean, it was kind of game time decision that we made, but I, it wasn't necessarily a challenge, but it worked out, I think.
That was costume designer Trish Somerville, right?
Yes, sorry, yeah.
Don, the last big speech for Mank, and what was your biggest creative challenge?
My challenge was before they even came to shoot the scene. My challenge was getting the set ready. I mean, in actuality, that was the same set that we used for the Meyer birthday party. We just took it and reconformed some of the elements and restylized the interior of it. We brought in more Gothic tracery. We brought in some ironwork into the dining hall, and we also built a long extension and hallway for the final walk and talk. And the challenge on that was actually early on in the production process, where I remember being on the parking lot at David's office and walking with one of my set designers, and we were actually reading the script to try to determine how much real estate we needed for them to be able to pull that off. And somehow or other, we got lucky on it. But, it was, my job on that set was, because of our limited finances and so forth, was, I sort of built this shell and I stylized it one way with detail for the Meyer birthday party. And then we took a 4 to 6 week break in between coming back and filming that final scene, where I did some conversion to it. We took fireplaces out and brought new ones in and repositioned them in different areas. We brought in the long dining table. We brought in the tapestries and the sidebars for serving food, and we brought in ironwork, and we brought in some different style architectural elements, as I said, the Gothic tracery and so forth. And then we added on that final hallway. And that was sort of the challenge for me, was, you know, pulling the physicality of it off, because we sort of knew where we were going with it. And, you know, it was just about how much time do we have to get this finished, you know? On a shoot day, I'm like a roadie. I hand the set over to people like Erik, and I go to the next one.
Ren, what about you for that last scene, the biggest creative challenge you faced and how you solved it?
Yeah, for us, when we came in, it was about sonic sense of scale and to match what Don had constructed. And David wanted to have Mank's entrance immediately inform the audience that he's inebriated and also cantankerous and tripping over. So it was very important that he heard the dialogue of, would you like me to get you a costume? As if Mank was completely oblivious to the fact that he had no idea. And then as he comes in and kind of announces, you know, he comes in and everyone thinks, oh, great, you're here. But then quickly realize he's hammered. David really wanted to have, it was very important for him to have the room get quiet with attention, and then people feeling awkward, and then filling it in with background noises. And then as Mank is sort of sidelined and put to the end of the table, he wanted the din to come up. And it was very important for David to kind of paint this sound of "you've been forgotten" until Mank smashes the glass and gets everyone's attention. And then from there, what was important sonically was to, as Mank starts doing his crazy speech, that we hear his voice echoing so much that in fact he hears his own voice and hears himself like, oh my God, I'm so loud, I'm hearing it in this giant space. And then as he walks over to the fireplace and tries to light his cigarette, he's speaking. And David, it was very important to David to hear his voice echo up into the fireplace that Don had built. And then but he wanted the sound to constantly be changing and in volume and perspective, all the while the shoes that our Foley team David was very specific about exactly the heel toe of each footfall, the amount of cleanliness, the amount of grit on the stone. And then finally, really at the end, you know, as we transition back to Victorville, the look of Hearst as he's like, okay, and he throws down his napkin and we transition. So there's a beautiful musical transition that happens at that same beat. So there's a lot of things happening from what we were dispatched to try and help elevate this sequence.
Well, and that sequence, I think, really speaks to the artistry that you brought to the film and the attention to detail that's so important in your work and in David's. I want to thank Erik Messerschmidt, the cinematographer of Mank, Donald Graham Burt, the production designer, and Ren Klyce, sound designer. Thank you all for your time and good luck.